Title: Why Your Mind Gets Loud at Night. There is a reason your mind gets louder at night. Not because you suddenly become weaker after dark, not because something is wrong with you, and not because the night is trying to hurt you. It happens because night removes the noise that helps you avoid yourself. All day, life keeps you moving. There are things to answer, things to carry, things to finish, people to respond to, practical tasks, ordinary interruptions, even when you're tired. The day still gives you structure, it gives you motion, it gives you somewhere to place your attention. But night does something very different. Night clears the room, it lowers the light, it softens the outside world. It takes away the small distractions that helped you keep going. And when that happens, the inside world becomes easier to hear. That is why a person can get through an entire day without breaking and still feel overwhelmed by a single quiet hour in the dark. Because during the day the mind is occupied, at night it is exposed, and once the room grows quiet enough, the thoughts you were outrunning begin to catch up. Sometimes they arrive softly, a memory, a face, a sentence someone said years ago. Sometimes they arrive all at once, a rush of worry, a strange ache in the chest, a wave of loneliness that feels larger than the room you're in. And sometimes it is not even one thought. It is an atmosphere, an inner noise, a pressure, a restless hum that makes it hard to settle into the night, even when your body is already asking for sleep. That is the part people rarely explain well. A loud mind at night is not always dramatic. It is often very quiet on the outside. No tears, no crisis, no scene. Just a person lying still while their thoughts refuse to lie down with them. Just a person sitting on the edge of a bed, or standing in the kitchen with a glass of water, or staring into a dark hallway, and feeling like the whole house has become too aware of them. There is a certain hour of the night when everything unfinished begins to feel personal. The house is quiet. The clock is visible. The body is tired. The light is thin. And suddenly, the mind begins bringing things back. The phone call you never made. The conversation you should have handled differently. The person you miss. The future you keep trying not to fear. The version of yourself you used to be. The one you wish you had become. The thing you cannot control. The thing you cannot undo. At night, these things do not knock politely. They sit down beside you. That is why so many people misunderstand what nighttime overthinking really is. They think it is simply a habit of thinking too much. But often, it is something deeper than that. It is accumulation. It is the emotional weight of many things that never received enough quiet attention during the day. It is the mind finally noticing what the rest of life helped you postpone. And once it notices, it does not always know how to stop. This is especially true for people who have become very skilled at functioning. The reliable ones, the composed ones, the practical ones, the people who get things done, the people who do not always talk about how much they carry. Those people often make it through the day so efficiently that even they forget there is a cost to holding everything together. Then night comes and the cost becomes audible, because darkness has a way of making emotional truth feel louder. What you brushed aside at noon may feel enormous at midnight. A simple regret becomes a whole life review. A passing worry becomes a prediction. A quiet loneliness becomes a verdict on your future. The mind starts making everything larger than it really is. That is one of the hardest things about night. It changes scale. A thought that might have lasted 30 seconds during the day can stretch into half an hour in the dark. A question with no answer can start sounding like an emergency. A small ache in the heart can begin to feel like evidence that something permanent has gone wrong. But night does not always create these feelings. It magnifies them. It takes what was already there and removes the distractions around it. That is why so many people say things like, "I was fine all day," or "I don't know why it hits me at night," or "The moment I lie down, everything starts." What they often mean is this: the day was busy enough to protect me from myself. The night was quiet enough to return me to myself. And for many people, that return is not immediately peaceful, because there are things inside them that are still unresolved, not necessarily in some dramatic, tragic way. Sometimes the unresolved things are very ordinary. A life that changed faster than the heart could accept. A relationship that looks stable from the outside but feels emotionally thin. A child who still loves you but no longer reaches for you in the same way. A retirement that gave you freedom but also took away your structure. A grief that no one asks about anymore. A fear about health. A fear about time. A fear about becoming less central in other people's lives. These things do not always break you during the day, but they may sit closer to you at night, because night is intimate. It strips away performance. During the day, you can be useful, you can be responsive, you can be needed, you can be organized, you can be in motion. But night asks a harder question. Who are you when there is nothing left to manage? That question can make the mind loud very quickly, because once there is no task to complete, the mind begins trying to complete you. It starts searching. What did I miss? What did I get wrong? What is still unresolved? What am I afraid of? What am I not saying? What am I not facing? Why does this still hurt? Why does this still matter? And because there are rarely clean answers at 1 in the morning, the mind begins circling. It replays, it rehearses, it reviews, it returns. The body lies still, the mind paces. That is why nighttime thinking feels so physically exhausting. You are not moving, but you are not resting. Your jaw tightens. Your breathing becomes shallower. Your chest holds tension without asking permission. Your stomach becomes part memory, part worry, part fatigue. Even the silence begins to feel heavy. And that heaviness can be confusing, especially for people who are used to being strong. Because strong people often assume they should be able to handle their own minds. They tell themselves, "Go to sleep. Stop thinking. Calm down. This is ridiculous. You are making it worse." Oh, but the mind rarely quiets down because it has been shamed. It quiets down when it no longer feels like every thought must be obeyed. That is a different process, a slower one, a more compassionate one, because sometimes the nighttime mind is not trying to destroy your peace. Sometimes it is trying in a clumsy way to protect you. It is scanning for danger, reviewing old pain, rehearsing future pain, trying to prevent surprise, trying to make sure you will not be caught unprepared again. The problem is not always the intention. The problem is the timing. At night, the mind often tries to protect you in the least restful way possible. It becomes hyper alert. It mistakes thought for action. It confuses repetition with preparation. It starts believing that if it worries long enough, it will somehow spare you from uncertainty. But uncertainty does not dissolve because you thought about it at 2:14 in the morning. It only steals your rest. That is why a loud mind at night can leave people feeling defeated by sunrise. Not because they did nothing, but because they were fighting something invisible for hours. And here is what most people miss. The deepest pain of the night is not always fear. Sometimes it is exposure. The day lets you stay in character. The night removes the costume. All day long, you are somebody in relation to tasks. A worker, a parent, a helper, a problem solver, a person answering messages, a person carrying the calendar, a person moving from one thing to the next. But when the lights are low and the house is still, those roles loosen. And what remains is not always comfortable, because what remains is the self underneath utility. The self that still feels grief. The self that still wonders whether life turned out the way it was supposed to. The self that still aches when old names surface. The self that still fears losing what matters. The self that sometimes feels less needed than before. The self that is not asking for productivity, but for meaning. And meaning is much harder to answer at night. At night, your mind does not only ask, what if something goes wrong? It also asks, what did all of this mean? Who am I now? What part of me have I neglected? What am I still carrying? What have I still not forgiven? What have I still not accepted? Those are not small questions. No wonder the mind gets loud. It is trying to stand in a dark room and answer questions that belong to an entire lifetime. And the human heart was never meant to settle all of that before sleep. Still, many people try. They treat the night like a courtroom, a therapist's office, a confession booth, a financial meeting, a medical consultation, a grief chamber, a moral trial. They lie there and review their whole existence with the harshest possible voice. And then they wonder why peace will not come. But peace cannot enter a room where everything is being cross-examined. That is why gentleness matters more than most people realize. Not softness in the sense of pretending things are easy, and not denial in the sense of pretending nothing hurts. Gentleness in the sense of refusing to make the night harder than it already is, because the nighttime mind gains power from urgency. It wants to convince you this matters now. This must be solved now. This feeling is final. This fear is truth. This loneliness is permanent. This regret defines you. But night is not always a reliable judge. It is a magnifier. It enlarges. It intensifies. It darkens contrast. What feels unbearable at 2 a.m. may feel understandable at 9 a.m. What feels permanent at midnight may feel temporary by breakfast. What sounds like certainty in the dark may reveal itself as exhaustion in the light. This does not mean the feeling is fake. It means the feeling is being seen through the lens of darkness. And darkness changes proportion. That is why the same life can feel manageable in the afternoon and impossible at night. That is why the same memory can seem neutral in daylight and heartbreaking at 1:30 in the morning. That is why loneliness can feel like a passing ache at lunch and like a life sentence before sleep. Night changes emotional geometry. Everything draws closer. Everything gets larger. Everything sounds more absolute. And if you do not know that, You start believing the night too quickly. You start treating every thought like evidence, every ache like a conclusion, every fear like a forecast. But a loud thought is not always a true thought. A repeated thought is not always an important thought. And a nighttime thought is certainly not always a wise thought. Sometimes it is just a tired thought, a lonely thought, a grief-soaked thought, a frightened thought, a thought that got louder because there was finally enough silence around it. There is another reason nighttime thinking can feel so persuasive. The body is tired, and when the body is tired, the mind loses some of its balance. A thought that could be shrugged off at noon may feel deeply convincing after midnight. A memory that would pass quickly during the day can start taking root when the nervous system is already worn down. The mind does not become smarter at night. It becomes less defended, and less defended does not always mean more truthful. Sometimes it only means more vulnerable. That is important to remember, especially for people who live alone, especially for people who are older, especially for people who have known loss, especially for people who keep most of their emotions private. Because private people often have very loud nights. Not because they are more fragile than others, but because so much of their inner life never gets enough daylight language. It stays unspoken, unshared, unprocessed, unwitnessed, and what is unwitnessed tends to return, if not in conversation, then in silence, if not at the dinner table, then in bed, if not in daylight, then after midnight. This is where loneliness becomes such a powerful amplifier, not only because no one is there, but because there is no one there to interrupt the logic of your fear, and no one to say, that is not the whole story. You are tired, you are hurt, you are not seeing this clearly right now. You do not need to solve this tonight. Without that outside voice, the mind starts trying to become its own companion. And often, it does a poor job of it. It talks too much, pushes too hard, asks the wrong questions in the wrong tone, tries to protect you by exhausting you. It keeps producing thoughts because thoughts have become the only form of company available. That is why nighttime thinking can feel both crowded and lonely at the same time. Your mind is full. The room is empty. Your body is still. Your inner world is loud. And somewhere inside that contradiction, many people begin believing something unfair about themselves. They begin believing that because they cannot rest easily, they must be doing life badly. But that is not necessarily true. Sometimes your mind is loud at night because your life has required too much performance and too little honest pause. And sometimes your mind is loud because you have become so skilled at getting through the day that your feelings are forced to wait until dark to be acknowledged. Sometimes your mind is loud because you have loved deeply, lost deeply, endured quietly, adjusted repeatedly, and some part of you is still trying to understand what all of that has done to you. That is not weakness. That is human accumulation. It is a mind and heart trying to metabolize a life that moved faster than reflection could keep up with. And that means the solution is not always to force silence. Sometimes the wiser move is to change your relationship to the noise. Instead of, something is wrong with me, you begin with, something in me wants attention. Instead of, I need to solve this right now, you begin with, I am not required to solve my whole life in the dark. Instead of, this thought must mean something serious. You begin with, this may be a loud thought, not a true one. Instead of, why am I like this? You begin with, what inside me has gone unheard for too long? That shift changes everything because the goal is not to destroy the mind. The goal is not to become thoughtless. The goal is not to win against the night. The goal is to become larger than the noise, to hear a thought without kneeling to it, to feel fear without obeying it, to notice sadness without turning it into prophecy, to let memory pass through without treating it as a summons. That kind of inner stance is not automatic. It is learned slowly, tenderly, repeatedly. And many people do not begin learning it until late in life, after years of trying to control themselves through force. But the inner world responds more deeply to recognition than to force. It softens when it feels seen. It settles when it feels less attacked. It quiets when it is no longer treated like an invader. A loud mind at night may be inconvenient. It may be exhausting. It may be painful. But it is not necessarily your enemy. Sometimes it is a messenger arriving too late and speaking too loudly. Sometimes it is grief without a proper chair. Sometimes it is loneliness without a witness. Sometimes it is fear trying to sound useful. Sometimes it is fatigue that has forgotten how to be quiet. Sometimes it is the heart asking for room in the only hour the world finally stops interrupting it. And when you begin to understand that, the night changes, not all at once, not every night, not dramatically, but enough. Enough that you stop turning every restless hour into a judgment about your life. Enough that you stop treating yourself like a problem because your mind has become noisy. Enough that you remember one very important truth. You do not need to solve your whole life tonight. Oh, you do not need to answer every fear before sunrise. You do not need to make peace with every regret in a single dark hour. You do not need to turn stillness into interrogation. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do at night is to let the room remain a room. Let the bed be a bed. Let the window be a window. Let the thought be a thought. Let the fear be a wave instead of a command. Let the loneliness be felt without turning it into a final identity. This is not avoidance. It is proportion. It is remembering that a difficult night is not the whole story of your life. It is remembering that darkness changes the sound of your thoughts. And maybe, more than anything else, it is remembering that your mind gets loud at night because you are still carrying something worth caring for. A life, a memory, a hope, a grief, a future, a self you have not fully stopped trying to protect. There is tenderness in that, even when it feels exhausting. So tonight, if the mind grows loud again, start here. The night is revealing what the day could not hold. That does not mean I must solve it all now. Then breathe, not to erase the thought, not to force peace, not to pretend nothing is there, just to make room. Because room is often what the mind is asking for. Not immediate answers, not perfect certainty, just room. Room to be noticed without ruling you. Room to be heard without becoming law. Room to pass through without taking the whole night with it. And that is where rest begins, not in becoming empty, not in becoming fearless, but in becoming larger than the noise. You are larger than the noise, even in the dark, even in the quiet, even when the clock reads 2:17 and the room feels too still. Especially then.